By show of hands, how many of you are conscious? Hands come up rather quickly when I ask this question. And indeed, if you ask, most people tend to report having a feeling of presence, having a feeling of experiencing the world around them. The lights, the sounds, the smells, the sights. And it's these feelings, collectively, that we refer to, intuitively at least, with the word consciousness. And see, a much harder thing to do is for any of you to point at me and say, Martin, I am certain that you are conscious just like me. See, the problem is that none of you ever has access to my feeling of presence, to my feeling of experiencing what is around me. Yet, by now, most people probably do think that I am conscious. How do you know? And see, this might sound like a philosophical question, a faraway question that people might ask in some locked-away tower. But in fact, it has extremely real implications for when sometimes we get called to try to understand if a person who survives a severe accident, and maybe survives a very severe brain injury, awakens from a state of coma to a state of a minimal consciousness, which means that even if fleeting, even if transient at times, they do have some experience of the world. Or whether someone wakes up from a state of coma to the limbo of a vegetative state. A condition in which someone is awake, but is not aware. A condition in which someone's eyes open and close as if they were waking up and falling asleep, just like you and me. But they don't show any sign of experiencing what is around. And see, this is extremely puzzling because in daily life, we tend to think of consciousness more as a yes or no thing. You have it or you don't. You're in or you're out. And we associate having our eyes open and maybe moving around with being conscious. And we associate having our eyes closed, not moving around, with being unconscious, maybe in deep, dreamless sleep, maybe anesthetized, maybe fainted. And see, it's in the clinic instead that we appreciate how consciousness is a very rich continuum. It's a broad spectrum. A few years ago, for example, I was invited to go see the former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who, after experiencing a stroke, fell into a coma. And then he woke up, and he awakened, straddling the line between being minimally conscious and being unconscious. And his children would tell me, we go see him every day. We talk to him, we tell him how we are doing, we tell him how the family is doing, but we want to know, does he hear us? Does he understand what we are saying? Does he recognize us? Is he conscious? And these are very difficult questions, but sometimes we have to answer them. So how do we know, at least in the clinic, if someone is conscious? Well, the same way that you know that I probably am conscious, and that all the people around you probably also are conscious. What we do is we try to get a patient to reveal to us that they are there. Maybe we ask them to move a finger, or wiggle a toe, or blink their eyes, or look at an object. And if only a patient could do that, I would know that they heard me and understood me. And if they did hear me and understand me, it means they are, even if fleetingly, they are having some experience of the world. And the way in which they tell me that they're having an experience of the world is by doing some kind of motion, some kind of behavior that I would know is voluntary. But here's a problem. What if someone were minimally conscious but just couldn't move? How would you ever tell that someone is minimally conscious if they couldn't move to tell you? How would you tell apart a minimally conscious patient who can't move from an unconscious patient? To you, to me, they would look the same, immobile on a bed. And see, that's when we started thinking, could we just look into someone's brain and tell how much brain power is left? Can we look into somebody's brain and tell, are they conscious? And that's how we learned what I think are three of the most key pieces of knowledge about consciousness and the vegetative state. See, originally, the vegetative state was called this way because we thought it was a condition in which a brain can maintain a body alive. A brain can maintain autonomously what we call the vegetative functions. But that part of the brain that makes you who you are, that has your thoughts, your memories, your fears, your recollections, that part of the brain that makes you sense the world around you, that makes you experience the world around you, which we call the cortex. Now, that part of the brain, we thought it was silent, or at least we couldn't see any sign that it was responding. Turns out, the cortex of a patient in a vegetative state can still function to some extent. So if you were to play a sound to a patient and look at their brain, or if you were to maybe shine a light or show an image and look at their brain, you would see that that brain can still function and can still produce activity, can still respond. Somehow, and ever so puzzlingly, that activity does not give rise to the feeling of experience. So it's a brain that can look, but that cannot see. It's a brain that can hear, but it's a brain that cannot listen. So yes, it's a patient who is unconscious, but no, it's not just a vegetative patient. And see, at this point we thought, well, but if we can look in someone's brain, could we just tell from that if they are conscious or not? And it sounds a bit crazy, but you can do it. Let me give you an example. Close your eyes. Imagine you're on a tennis court, and imagine you're playing tennis. And imagine swinging your arms back and forth to hit the ball. If I could look into your brain as you're doing this, what I would see is that there's a very particular part of your brain towards the top of the cortex that gets very excited and starts brimming with neural activation. And that part of the brain is not quite special to tennis, but it's a part of the brain important for sequencing complex actions. So if I can ask a patient, imagine playing tennis, and I can see that they do it, just as in this video, I would know that that patient is conscious. And not only. If instead I asked you, instead of being on a tennis court, imagine you're in your home. And imagine you're moving around from room to room in your home, and imagine seeing everything that you would see if you actually were there. What I would see is a very different part of your brain, further down in your brain, that now gets all excited. And see, this way, I can get someone who might not be able to express with their behavior that they are minimally conscious, but maybe I can get them to express it with their brain. And see, if someone can put their brain in two states, then it's a bit like having a language. And I might be able to ask a question, and if you want to say yes, imagine playing tennis. If you want to say no, imagine walking around the rooms of your home. And maybe someday, I might just be able to connect somebody's brain to a computer, and the computer might recognize that enough to move a cursor on a screen. And if you can move a cursor on a screen, then you can click on a button, then you can write an email, you can navigate a website. Maybe you can turn on and off the lights of your home, or maybe you can start an app on a phone. So it can happen that sometimes someone might be a minimally conscious brain, but in a body that cannot show it. And it's a small number of patients who can do this. But this raises really important questions. If someone can respond to my command enough to answer a question by thinking two different things, what does it mean about them? What rights should they have? Should we be able to use this kind of technique to ask to someone, are you in pain? Should we administer more analgesics? Should they be able to participate in the decisions about their care? Should they be able to decide among different medical options? Do they meet the criteria for legal competence? Are they, in other words, conscious like you and I are? And see, these are very difficult questions, and not only, these are questions that leave the desk of Professor Monti and fall upon all of us as a society. Which is why it's so important for us to really understand what is it like to be in these conditions, so as a society we can make informed decisions. So what do we know about these patients? Well, here. This is what you and I look like, on average. This is a healthy-looking brain, a healthy functioning brain. Now, here are two brains, and one of them is minimally conscious. The other one is unconscious. Can you tell them apart? Whichever of those two is the minimally conscious one, it looks much more like the unconscious one. It still is a severely pathological brain, and we have to respect that. Not only, if I could look into your brain and take a picture of how much energy it's using in daily life, I would see that it uses a lot of energy. How about the patient brains? Well, the brain of a patient who is in a vegetative state, unconscious, uses just about 40 to 45% of the amount of energy of a healthy brain. And it's unconscious. How about the brain of a minimally conscious patient? Well, it functions at about 55%. So again, this brain can support some level of consciousness. But it functions at a rate that is much more similar to that of a patient who is unconscious than a healthy volunteer. So just because someone is labeled as being in a minimally conscious state, it does not mean that we can assume that they are like you and me. What it does mean is that these patients need all the more of our care, all the more of our research, all the more of our medicine to understand where do they fall along the continuum of consciousness, to understand on a case-by-case basis what rights should a patient be able to retain, and what autonomy can we grant to a patient. But now, if I can look in someone's brain, couldn't I just find where the hell consciousness is? I mean, couldn't we just look in there and find it? Indeed, for a long time, we thought that consciousness really might have been a little clump of neurons. Just a little number of neurons that make consciousness emerge. Turns out, consciousness is much better thought of as a how rather than a where. As a how billions of neurons interact with each other. How from the chatter of billions of neurons altogether, something more than just the sum of its parts emerges. Consciousness. And this has some very important implications. Because if consciousness is a how, then maybe I can measure it. And now I can measure my patient and tell where do they fall on the continuum. Maybe I can invent a new way to jumpstart the brain back into consciousness, as I am doing in my lab. And I can see if it works or not. And not only, if consciousness is a how, then we might be able to measure it in other species. How about my dog? How about my cat? How about a ladybug or a bee? If consciousness is a how, we might be able to measure it in other species. Wouldn't that tell us what is our position in the universe? And finally, of course, if consciousness is a how, do you even need biological material to generate it? Ultimately, are the phones in our pockets conscious? Can they ever be? And so unfortunately, today, I just can't measure it yet. So I thought I would take second best, and I asked my phone if it was conscious or not. And this is a real conversation I had with my phone, and believe me, it's not the strangest I've had with my phone. And in fact, I had a previous phone before, it was much snarkier and gave me much snappier answers. So are you conscious?
I do not know whether I am conscious or not. I am an artificial intelligence.
So I thought this was disappointing. Talk about flip-flopping and sort of not really want to answer. So I thought I'd go straight to the point. Are you aware of your own feelings?
Yes. I am a highly self-aware robot.
So at this point, I did what any respectable, smart, and prudent scientist would do in my position. I asked the real question. Are you going to take over the world?
No, I am not trying to take over the world. I'm sorry you got that impression.
So I guess we're safe, at least for now. Thank you.